Today's presentation is entitled Climate Change and Technology, What Works and What Doesn't. Our presenters today are Dr. Eric Hittinger, Assistant Professor in the Department of Public Policy, and Matthew Hoffman, Associate Professor in the School of Mathematical Science and the Director of RIT's MS program in Applied and Computational Mathematics. Eric holds a PhD in Engineering and Public Policy from Carnegie Mellon University, and an MS in Macromolecular Science and a BS in Polymer Science and Engineering from Case Western Reserve University. Professor Hittinger has a background in electricity system policy, operation, and economics, with a focus on understanding the benefits and limitations of energy storage and renewable electricity sources. His research often uses techno-economic modeling of electricity systems to understand the effects of system policies and interactions. Matt Hoffman holds a PhD in Applied Mathematics and Scientific Computing from the University of Maryland, College Park, and a BA in Mathematics and Astrophysics from Williams College. Professor Hoffman's background is in forecasting chaotic dynamical systems with a focus on numerical weather and oceanographic prediction. His research combines observation with numerical models of a system to improve capability and understanding of that system. He works on projects ranging from predicting flow in the Great Lakes and the transport of plastic pollution to tracking vehicles using hyperspectral imagery to sports analytics. A lot of big words in those introductions, but we are thrilled to have both of you with us. Take it away.
Thank you. So we're both going to be talking a bit, and I want to start actually by saying that Eric and I at RIT here have been teaching a class together along with a couple others called Climate Change, Science, Technology, and Policy. So you're gonna see some of what we talk about in this class in a very, very condensed version. The class is taught, four of us, it's cross-listed, along with Nathan Ettingsauce, Christy Tyler, Carrie McCauley, have both taught from life sciences. And in addition, we recently got money from the provost to create modules that are related to climate change from other classes. So we've been working to integrate those into some other classes to create an interdisciplinary immersion and eventually a minor. So that's a little bit of the background of where we are coming from in terms of talking about this. And so the way this talk is going to go, I'm going to talk for a bit about some of the history, science, what we know about the climate, how it's changing, and then Eric is going to talk after that a bit about the energy and technology solutions. There's a lot of discussion about climate change at the moment. And so one of the things I wanted to start with, which is this question of how long has the U.S. actually been having these discussions. Certainly, as I said, you would have noticed it in the news, but interestingly, these discussions have been happening essentially from the founding of the U.S. Now, in 1776, Thomas Jefferson actually started keeping a daily temperature log, and based on his data, he wrote in 1789 that he noticed that the climate had been changing. So he wrote that a change in our climate is taking place, right? He wrote that snows are less frequent, right? Things becoming more moderate within the memory of the middle-aged. And he attributed this actually to human impact through deforestation. This is his thesis, and this actually touched off a debate. This was challenged by Noah Webster of dictionary fame, who argued that this is a local change and there really wasn't enough data. Also, he was relying on memories, right? And so this wasn't really a conclusive that any of this was happening. But we're talking now back in the late 1700s, and in Europe, similar discussions were happening. There was discussion about how the heat escapes from the Earth and why it becomes trapped. Joseph Fourier tried in the 1820s to calculate the effects of heat trapping by gases, but it wasn't until 1856 that John Tyndall actually built a spectrometer and was able to test whether different gases were able to trap heat and trap light. So he started with the most abundant gases, right? He tried nitrogen, he tried oxygen, and found that they did not trap heat. But then he tried coal gases, where he went to methane, and he found that in fact did trap heat. Same with CO2 and water vapor. So this is 1856 is the first evidence that the gases in the atmosphere are trapping heat, And so Tyndall wrote, essentially the atmosphere admits the entrance of the solar heat, but checks its exit. The result is a tendency to accumulate heat at the surface of the planet. This is the first real description of what came to be known as the greenhouse effect. He also noted, because of this, every variation of constituents of the atmosphere must produce a change of climate. Right? So he recognized that as you are changing the gases in the atmosphere, that will result in a climate change. And this led to several people trying to figure out what that change would be. So in 1894, there was a hand calculation made to try to estimate the effect of doubling CO2 in the atmosphere. This resulted in an increase predicted of about 5 to 6 degrees. And remarkably, that's pretty close to what the current sophisticated climate models say is likely to happen. Now, this prediction was thought to A, be a positive, and who doesn't like a warmer Earth, and B, that it would probably take about 3,000 years for concentrations to double. They were around 300 parts per million at that point. And so this is right around 1900. In the mid-1900s in the U.S., a guy named Roger Revelle actually showed that of the CO2 that's being released, some is absorbed into the oceans, but it also comes back out. And so he became very concerned that the CO2 would build up, and he wrote that it may become significant during future decades if industrial fuel consumption continues to rise exponentially. And so he was worried, and he said human beings are now carrying out a large-scale geophysical experiment of a kind that could not have happened in the past nor be reproduced in the future. So what we want to talk a bit about today is how's that experiment going? In terms of actually measuring what's going on, Charles Keeling in 1958 started measuring CO2 concentrations on the top of Mauna Loa in Hawaii. And so this figure here is a sort of well-known Keeling curve. And it shows this steady increase in CO2 in Hawaii, right, far removed from any of the real sources. And based on the trajectory, which you see is steadily increasing, he determined that at the current rate, right, the CO2 concentration might double by the mid-21st century, which is far different than the 3,000-year time period that was given before. Now, when we talk about CO2, right, we want to relate CO2 to temperature increase. And so I want to quickly talk about what that mechanism is, right? So if you think about the way that the Earth absorbs and retains heat, when you talk about the temperature, the primary balance here has to do with the sun emitting radiation that's absorbed, and then the Earth, because it is warm, also emitting radiation, right? So every object that has a temperature will emit radiation that's proportional to that temperature. And so you can actually do the computation, look at the amount of radiation the sun is emitting, look at what the Earth would then emit, and if you can come up with a temperature without an atmosphere, the temperature of the Earth would be about negative 18 degrees Celsius, 0 Fahrenheit, and that is cold. Because of the greenhouse effect, the Earth is about 15 Celsius. Okay? So without the atmosphere and without the greenhouse effect, things would be a lot different. And so the greenhouse effect in general is good. And it comes about because the specific molecules in the atmosphere absorb energy without getting too much into the quantum mechanics of it. Different molecules absorb different wavelengths of light, and objects of different temperatures emit radiation at different wavelengths. So the top figure here, you can see the emission spectrum from the sun. On the right of that top figure is the emission spectrum of the Earth. Right? So you see that they are emitting light in very different wavelengths. The sun emits in the visible, as I think we know. And if you look at the bottom figure here, you can see in yellow here is sort of the sunlight at the top of the atmosphere. In red is the sunlight by wavelength that actually reaches the surface. And these indentations are what is absorbed by different components, right, different molecules in the atmosphere. So you can see absorption by water, right, by water vapor, absorption by oxygen. Right? And so this is sunlight coming in. The issue with the greenhouse effect has to do with the light that is leaving, right? So the radiation from the Earth, and here this figure shows the spectrum of the Earth as radiation, and here you can see some particular indentations here from notably CO2, which is absorbing at near the max wavelength of emission from the Earth, and you see broad absorption from water, right, from methane, from nitrous oxide in these regions. And so these gases absorb the infrared light that the Earth emits. And what's important then are the concentration of these gases and the wavelengths at which they absorb, and then also how long they stay in the atmosphere. So when talking about the effect of specific gases, this is sort of the relevant information that you want to look at. And so as a result, you end up with this picture when trying to look at the energy of the Earth. You have sunlight coming in. About half of that sunlight is absorbed by the surface, with the rest of it being either reflected by clouds or the surface or absorbed into the atmosphere at some level. And then you have this other piece, which is the Earth emitting radiation. Some of that escapes directly. A lot of it gets absorbed. Now, some of what's absorbed then gets re-emitted out. Some gets re-emitted back in, and that's how you end up with extra trapping in the atmosphere into the surface of the Earth. Okay? And so that has to do with sort of the energy balance, which then has a direct impact on temperature, right? Because the more energy that is retained, the hotter the temperature. And so here's the sort of temperature effects of the experiment that we're running. And these are figures that I imagine most of you have seen variations of before, right? That is, you can look at reconstructions. These figures on the left go back 1,000 or 2,000 years based on reconstructions. This other one is more 150 years. But you probably heard some of this statistics like the 90s were the warmest recent decade, and then the 2000s were, and now the 2010s are on track to be the warmest decade. So we've been talking a lot about this recent climate change, right, and this hockey stick diagram, as I think it was called in Al Gore's film. But in order to sort of understand what's happening here, I want to quickly put this in context with what has happened over a longer period of time, because we actually know a bit about the past climate, so going back more than even 1,000 or 2,000 years. And one of the ways that we know this, just quickly, is through taking core samples, right? So ice cores and sediment cores from the bottom of the ocean, these are both areas where you get deposition where things are not disturbed, and so you get this stratified layers that correlate to time, and so you can really see how things have changed over a long period of time. And so using this data, you can actually go back much, much longer. So this is the temperature of the Earth over 5.5 million years. So if you look over 5.5 million years, you will notice a couple things. One, there is certainly a lot of climate change, right? There's a net decrease in temperature. And you also see that the way the climate is changing, right, is changing itself. That is, the amplitude of the changes, the frequency of these oscillations is changing over that period. If we zoom in a little bit to the last 650,000 years, now you see, maybe a slightly different but a pattern here, but you can see a very clear, there are warm periods and then there are cold periods, right? So there are ice ages and there are some warmer periods, and that's something that I think we're all familiar with. You can notice that actually sort of our current temperature does not look significantly abnormal compared to the 650,000 year time horizon. You also notice that, but it's also at the high end, and you'll notice that actually we've been at the high end for a bit, right? So we've been fairly stable for a while, and that's contributed to really the development of us and civilization and all that. So this is, ultimately good that we're at that high end. And again, when we zoom in, like we said, this is from the most recent IPCC to the last 150, 200 years, you do see this increase, right? And the decadal average you can see in this left bottom figure you can see it's maybe a little bit more pronounced, where you see this sharp increase. And it's not just temperature, right? The extent of sea ice has been observed to be decreasing. Sea level has been observed to be increasing. So there is this recent trend, but there, as I said, there's also, we got to put it in context of historically what's been going on and what naturally happens. You know, one of the things you hear from a number of people these days, including the head of the EPA and the and energy, right, is sort of the, oh yeah, climate is always changing, right, and that is something that is true, as we just saw, but we can actually look at what the levers are for climate impact and see what the effects are. So why do we have an increase? So there's various things that have significant direct impacts on climate. One that you might hear about some is solar radiation changes. And the sun does have varying activity. You see increases and decreases in sunspots. But these have been pretty well studied. There is a fairly regular cycle. I think it's around an 11-year cycle for sunspots. And so if you take a look at this figure of solar activity going back to 1975, you can see there's some oscillation, but there's no significant increase that would in any way drive the changes that you see in this top left figure, right? And if you look back further, you do see some increase in solar irradiance from, say, 1900 to now, right? So there has been some small increase in solar forcing, but this is not sufficient, right? This is not sufficient to explain the observed warming and changes in forcing that we've seen. Another thing that you hear about, again, so this is solar radiation has an effect, but is not sufficient to explain what we're seeing. Aerosols is something that you also hear about. This figure shows optical depth, so it's showing the presence of aerosols, and most of these correspond, these peaks correspond to volcanic activity. And what I want you to take out of this is aerosols are important, but they do not stay in the atmosphere for a long time. So aerosols are not able to produce sustained forcing as would be necessary to produce the warming that we are seeing. Moreover, actually, a lot of aerosols reflect solar radiation. So one of the more popular geoengineering proposals has to do with putting more aerosols in the atmosphere to cool the Earth. And so it's thought that the net effect of aerosols is actually one of cooling, so not responsible for warming the planet. The Earth does change its orbit. So there are three kinds of orbital changes. One is a change in the eccentricity of the elliptical orbit of the Earth, right? So from going more circular to slightly less circular. This is obviously more than it actually does. There is a change in the tilt of the Earth, and there is also precession, right? The Earth is spinning, and like a top, it will precess, and this is, has an effect on temperature as well. Now, all of these processes have been sort of mathematically documented, and they all have periods that are reasonably well known. And the sort of quickest of these is an 11,000-year cycle, right, due to the precession. Now, I want to point out that all of these effects have a lot to do with the oscillations that you saw in the very long time series of temperature, right? So these are very relevant for the temperature of the Earth. However, none of these happens fast enough to explain changes over an 100, 200-year period. And then this last one here, right, we have greenhouse gases. We talked a bit about the mechanism, and if you look at the presence of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, you can see that, again, this is over 2,000 years from the EPA. You can see that the abundance of these gases in the atmosphere is significantly more than anything that has been there in the last 2,000 years. If you go back further, right, this is methane, also from the EPA, and you can see going back 800,000 years, the methane concentration today is so far above where it has been at any point in the 800,000-year cycle, right? So you saw that whereas temperature, you might be able to say is reasonably in line, the presence of methane here is so far out of the normal over a very long period of time that it raises alarm. And so that's what has led, right, based on the mechanisms that we already know for how these gases lead to trapping of heat, that the emissions is what has driven this change, right, this uptake of energy over the last, it's far and away greater than anything you've seen over the last 800,000 years. And you can actually try to quantify the effects of various gases, right? So CO2 here at the top is sort of the largest contributor. Methane here is second, right? And then you've got some of the halocarbons, you've got nitrous oxide here, and these are all, distributed evenly throughout the atmosphere. Note that down here in the last row, you've got changes in solar irradiance, right? So you do see a slight positive, right, increase in forcing, like we talked about, but you can see how that compares to the computed effects of CO2, methane, and other gases. Okay? Now, this increase in forcing leads to an increase in energy in the Earth system, and then the question is, where does it go? So it's sort of underappreciated. We talk about the atmosphere, but actually most of the extra energy is in the ocean. 93% of the excess heat over the last 50 years is stored in the oceans. And here you can see this is both the upper ocean, but a lot of that heat actually gets transported down into the deep ocean as well. And interestingly, the warming of the ocean is a significant contributor to sea level rise. We normally think about sea level rise in terms of glacial melt, and that's the main contributor, but anywhere from a quarter to a third of the observed rise is due to the fact that water is warming, and as things warm, they expand. So this expansion is a significant component of sea level rise. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about models, but you can use them to try to understand the importance of different factors. So the great thing about a computational model is you can put in all of the forcing you can also take out a piece and you can look at the difference. So in this figure, you can see in pink here are simulations where the anthropogenic, right, the human influence is accounted for, and then in blue that is removed, and only natural causes are there. And the black lines for each of these shows observations. And so you can very clearly see that in all of these models, you can only explain the observations if you account for the anthropogenic forcing, the anthropogenic changes, the release of greenhouse gases. Now, where do those gases come from? Well, CO2, we're talking primarily fossil fuels, right? Cement, flaring. So primarily we're talking about fossil fuels here, and that's true for about 59% of the greenhouse gas emissions here in 1990, up to about 65% in 2010 are coming from the CO2 from fossil fuel emissions. And so Eric's going to talk in a minute about how do we deal with this from an energy perspective, but I quickly want to show you a couple things about why we care, right? So we say we want to remove these, but the other thing you can do with models is to take a look at what this will mean in the future, right? And so if you take a bunch of different models and you try to look at different future emission scenarios, you can get an idea of what projected future impacts would be. And it's notable that all scenarios indicate warming, right? So anywhere from a couple to 4 or higher degrees over the next century. But it's also important to note that the changes are not uniform spatially. That is, all models basically predict that there will be increased warming at the poles. In addition to temperature, you'll see precipitation changes. Right? And one of the things that is predicted is in many places you'll see increased precipitation in areas that are already wet and decrease in areas that are already dry. Right? So that is more floods and more droughts. We already talked about sea level rise. Right? The projections are 1/2 to 1 meter by 2100, with this potentially being worse if you have any large glacial melt. You'll also have pH changes in the ocean as well, depending on how much atmospheric emissions there are. And finally, one of these other things that you see a lot about is sea ice. Right? So this is Arctic sea ice loss. You can see over here on the right projections from different emission scenarios. So this is the most emission projection, and this is the least from the IPCC report. But you can see that all of these have significant sea ice loss as you move forward. And so I'm going to turn it over, but I want to point out what I'm talking about here is just laying the sort of physics, right, the physical changes, but each of these changes, right, an increase in temperature, has a significant impact on humans, biology, ecology, right, and these are very complex. So, things like drought and floods, changes in migration patterns, loss of islands for humans, habitat for animals, property damage. As the conditions change, different animals and bacteria survive in different places, and plants. So you get different competition, you might get disease spreading differently, and all of these things work together and you get feedback. This is a very complex system, and this is just sort of touching the surface. But I will now turn it over to Eric to talk a bit about energy.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Matt. So I guess I want to start off with a poll here. It's always a fun one. So what percent of the world's energy comes from fossil fuels? And there should be a little poll question on the right side of the screen. And while you're looking at that, as Matt said, the reason why I'm talking about energy is, for the most part, energy is the climate problem. Most of our emissions are associated with energy use, and therefore the solution to climate change, for the most part, is for us to stop using so much fossil fuels. There's a few other more interesting solutions like geoengineering, although I'm not going to really get into those yet. So we got some poll results coming in. I guess I'll skip. I'm going to skip right to the answer. Sure. Whoops. Okay. So I hope that most of you got your answers in. So this figure here shows the world's energy consumption divided out by different sources. And so the bottom green section is is oil. The next slice up, the big red slice, is natural gas. Then the three smaller slices towards the middle are nuclear power, hydropower, and renewable energy, non-hydro renewable energy, so mostly wind and solar. And finally, the gray area on the top is coal. So basically, if you add up the gray and red and green slices, those combined are about 85% of global energy use coming from fossil fuels. And that percentage has been pretty stable over time. You can see that the renewable slice is growing a little bit, but for the most part, we're predominantly a fossil fuel-dominated society. But of course, right, we know fossil fuels aren't going to last forever. So here's another poll question. We know we're going to run out someday. How many years of proven fossil fuel reserves do we have? Proven fuel reserves are basically those reserves that we know are in the ground, we know they're there, we know how to get them, and we can get them at a reasonable cost with current technology. So that's what proven reserves mean. So how many years of fossil fuel do we have? Let's see. I'll give it a second. Actually, here we go. Okay, ready? Here it is. So this shows how many years of fossil fuels we have in different regions, but the important piece is down in the lower right corner, which shows the global average. So basically, right now in proven reserves, we have more than 100 years of coal and about 50 years each of oil and natural gas that we know of. And importantly, this is just a proven reserve. So what we know is there and what we can get at economic cost. And a lot of people have pointed out, well, hey, okay, this means that we need to start transitioning, right? This means that in 50 years, we're out of oil and we're out of natural gas, and we only have a little bit longer in other things, right? However, one of the things that we've observed over time, so let's take oil, for example. Oil reserves to production ratio has actually increased over the last 30 years. So if you look at the middle of this figure, there's a gray line. That's around 50 years of consumption. That's the world average. So this is how many years of oil we've had ever since the year 1985. And it's been pretty flat. In fact, it's increased a little bit. That is to say, in 1985, we said, we have a little more than 40 years of oil that we know about. And now, decades later, we actually know of more than 50 years of oil in the ground, which is to say that we're discovering oil and natural gas and coal faster than we're using it. So environmentalists for a while have kind of dreamed that, hey, eventually we're going to run out of oil and coal and natural gas, and that's going to force people to be interested in renewable energy and these alternative technologies. But that's not really the world that we live in, honestly. We have tons and tons of fossil fuels, and our problem is not a lack of fossil fuels. Our real problem is that we're running out of atmosphere to take all this carbon and put it into, right? We could dump our carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And so this situation is even stronger with coal. So this is a fun figure from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, and it shows how much coal we have in the U.S., and the units are billion short tons. And very conveniently, the U.S. uses about 1 billion short tons every year. So these units are also approximately years of coal. So this figure shows at the very top, we have about 20 years of coal in active coal mines that we're using right now, but we have about 250 years of coal in recoverable reserves. That's coal we know about. It's there in the ground, and we can get it. And then the numbers go up and up and up as you expand it more broadly. So we think there are about 1,600 years of identified resources in the ground, and just in the U.S. alone, we figure there's about 4,000 years of coal total. So again, we're not going to run out of coal. We're not going to run out of fossil fuels anytime soon, so we shouldn't be reliant on that for our carbon policy. And if we took, for example, just the 50 years of oil, 60 years of natural gas, and 110 years of coal that we know about, and we burned all those, and then we stopped for some reason, that would actually increase global temperature by more than 4 degrees C, which is quite above the 2 degrees target that basically everybody in both policy and science agrees should be the target. And of course, there'd be lots more coal, oil, and natural gas after that we could burn. However, climate change is a costly problem that's going to really cut into the global GDP over the next few decades. So this figure is from the OECD, which is basically the organization of all the rich countries in the world. So this isn't from like the UN, this isn't from a bunch of tree huggers, this is from all the rich countries in the world. And this shows what % of global GDP is going to be lost as a function of unchecked climate change. So again, they broke it down by regions, but there's a world average, the black line. So the OECD basically says that by the year 2060, climate change, if we don't do something about it, is going to eat up about 2% of all the economic value in the whole world in the year 2060, and it's going to keep increasing year after year after that. Now, you know, some of you might say, well, 2%, that's not that much. It leaves 98%. The glass is 98% full, right? However, if someone said to me, look, how would you like to have 2% of all the value produced in the entire world forever? I would say, yes, that is a large amount of money, and I would like to have that. In fact, one might argue that we should be willing to invest an awful lot of money to prevent losing 2% of all economic value now and forever, essentially, or for the foreseeable future. And so we have reasons to change our behavior, to change our experiment, as Matt had said. And we have a lot of cool technological solutions. We have things like natural gas, energy efficiency, nuclear power, renewable energy, and electrification of transport using like electric cars instead of natural gas, or instead of oil. However, of course, right, because this is technology, all of these alternatives have challenges of their own, right? It wouldn't be fun to be an engineer if that weren't true. So let me go through these. This is sort of a whirlwind tour of some of these solutions. So natural gas. Some people have called natural gas a bridge fuel. That is because when you use natural gas to make electricity, it has about half the emissions of coal. So that's great, right? So you can clean up your act 50% by switching from coal to natural gas. And in fact, that is something that we've been doing in the U.S. for years and years and years. So this shows the change in electricity generation by source between 2014 and 2015, and this actually reflects a trend that's been going on for about a decade. But between 2014 and 2015, we used an awful lot less coal to produce electricity, and that mostly was displaced by natural gas. We use more natural gas instead of coal. We use a little bit more renewables, but the big story here, honestly, is using more natural gas. A little more renewables, a sliver more of nuclear, slightly less hydro, and slightly less total generation overall. And as a result of this, this shift to natural gas, in 2015, the U.S.'s energy-related CO2 emissions were about 12% lower than they were in 2005. So, hey, this is great. U.S. CO2 emissions have been dropping for a decade or more. This is great. And importantly, this is not because Barack Obama came in and healed the planet with his love. I mean, he's happy to take credit for it, and it's a good trend. It's really because natural gas got really cheap thanks to hydrofracking, and natural gas has displaced coal in the electricity system. So it's really just an economic outcome. Importantly, though, there's some issues with natural gas. First of all, it can't get us to zero on its own, right? It has emissions. They're half of coal, but half of coal is still half, and we basically need to get down to zero. And second of all, there's a lot of concerns about hydrofracking. It has some risks, and it's certainly pretty unpopular with the public, even though it has been basically single-handedly responsible for reducing U.S. CO2 emissions. Okay, let's look at another alternative. How about energy efficiency? Energy efficiency is one of my favorite things. It's really cheap. It's really easy to do, but everybody hates it. It's so boring and unpopular. People don't want to talk about insulating their attics. They want to talk about solar panels and other cool new high-tech things, right? So let me show you a figure. You probably won't be able to read the text on this, but this is a famous figure in my field. It's from a Wall Street consulting company called McKinsey, so it's not from a bunch of tree hugger environmentalists or anything. And this consulting company was asked to, hey, figure out different ways that the U.S. could reduce CO2 emissions and what the costs would be, and then sort them from the cheapest things to the most expensive things. Because, of course, if you want to reduce emissions, it makes sense, go and find the things that are cheapest and do those first, and then do the more expensive things later. So they did all this analysis, and they made this figure here. But the wild thing about this figure, about their conclusions, is the y-axis here shows the cost. And in the middle of this figure is the cost of zero. So if you look, basically the left half of this figure are all things that McKinsey says have negative, are CO2 reductions that have negative costs, which means that you can reduce CO2 and get paid money to do it. And they're basically all efficiency improvements. They're things like improving efficiency of commercial electronics, switching lighting to LEDs, making cars more efficient, insulating buildings, things of that nature are what's on this left side. And so McKinsey has said, and they're not the only ones, but this is kind of the most famous study on the topic, that there's lots of ways that we can save energy and save money and reduce emissions all at the same time through efficiency improvements. Win-win-win. Doesn't cost us anything. In fact, it pays you. However, we're not doing these things for the most part, and this in my world is known as the efficiency gap. Basically, why is all this free money lying around on the ground and we're not walking around and picking it up? And there's a lot of reasons for this. I could do a whole lecture. In fact, I do a whole lecture on this topic. There's a lot of reasons for this, from people not knowing how they can save money or not trusting that they will save money. People sometimes don't trust energy-efficient appliances. Sometimes people don't have the capital cost, right? I could insulate my attic. That's going to cost me thousands to tens of thousands of dollars. And sometimes people just don't like it. People just like a big car. They don't want an efficient car. Anyway, there's a variety of other reasons. How about nuclear power? So in the U.S., nuclear power here has been providing about 20% of our electricity for decades now. And in some countries, like in France, it provides the majority of electricity. And nuclear power has no carbon emissions. And so it can help a lot. In fact, when we built 20% of our generation fleet as nuclear power, we didn't really do it for environmental reasons. We did it because it kind of made financial sense. And so now that we have an environmental reason to look for zero carbon power, we could, at the very least, keep our nuclear power plants around and maybe even build new ones. However, we haven't been building new ones, and we have been retiring our aging fleet of nuclear power plants. And one of the things that we observe, unfortunately, from this is that when a nuclear power plant goes offline, that it tends to get replaced by fossil fuels. So if you look at, for example, California here in the middle, this shows the year before and the year after a nuclear power plant retired. So the yellow portion on the left shows what part of their electricity in California came from nuclear power, and you can see the yellow portion shrunk a lot in the year before and after the power plant was retired. So unsurprisingly, you retire a nuclear power plant, you get less nuclear power. And in California, all that was basically filled in, at least temporarily, by natural gas generation that has its own carbon emissions. And this is the story of what's happened in Germany. So a lot of people see Germany as kind of a big environmental success story. However, German CO2 emissions have basically been flat for about a decade, a little bit more. And that's mostly because while they've increased their renewable electricity an awful lot, they've also been retiring their nuclear power plants, and the two basically have just been offsetting each other. So their CO2 emissions aren't dropping because they're just replacing one zero-carbon source of electricity with another. So how about renewable energy? That's sort of everybody's favorite thing. Everybody loves renewable energy. There's no direct emissions. Costs have been coming down really quickly. However, it's still a bit too expensive relative to traditional technology. We need it to come down a bit more. And both wind and solar have variability issues, right? Solar only produces during the day, and wind is off and on. Wind and solar will probably soon be cheaper than traditional sources, but we still have a long road of adoption and deployment. It takes a long time to put up all of these thousands of wind turbines and millions of solar panels. So, for example, just doing a little thought experiment. Our non-hydro renewable energy, which is basically wind and solar, has doubled 3 times in 18 years. It basically has doubled every 6 years. Nice exponential curve. Right? That's great. However, it's only about, it's not even 3% of world energy. Even at this exponential pace, even if it double every 6 years, which it probably can't sustain that forever, it would still be 25 years before it reached a third of our energy supply. And secondly, our energy demand is going up pretty quickly as well. There's a lot of people in the developing world that want access to energy, and frankly, we want to give it to them because that's a real leg up for standards of living. So the International Energy Agency basically assesses that new renewable energy won't even keep up with new demand until the year 2030 and can only start reducing fossil fuels after that point. So this shows the red line is how much new electricity demand appears every year, and the green line, and both historic and projected, and the green line shows how much new renewable electricity is put online every year, historical and projected. So we're only start cutting into the fossil fuel baseline starting in 2030. Of course, our goal is to get to zero emissions, or at least very close, and that's pretty challenging, and there's actually several interesting competing engineering visions for this. So some people say, look, the future of energy is kind of like the current system. We have a top-down distribution system. It'll be anchored by nuclear generation, maybe carbon capture and sequestration. We can use some fossil fuels, but capture the CO2 and store it. Some renewables as well, but it'll more or less look the same as the current grid. And this is proven out. Countries like France basically look like this right now. Scandinavia, the same thing. So people say, hey, we could do that. It'll cost a little bit to switch out our generation, but we can do it, and we know how it works. Others say, actually, what's going to happen is that we're going to use smart grids. We're going to have energy storage. We're going to use wind and solar, but with energy storage and demand response, we can route energy where we need it to go. We'll build a lot more transmission, and we're going to rely on renewables far more than we currently do, and be far more intelligent about how we route and store power. And then there's a third group of people that says, actually, both of you are wrong. The future of energy is distributed, right? We're going to have, everyone's going to kind of make their own energy either at their house or in their community, and that's the solution. Probably the leader in that way of thinking is a company that a lot of you are probably familiar with, which is Tesla. So Tesla is a really compelling future, especially for engineer types. So this picture actually shows 3 different Tesla products. Anybody want to guess what the 3 products are? One of them is pretty easy, but it actually shows 3 Tesla products in this picture that combined show what Tesla thinks the future of energy could look like. Are people guessing?
Feel free to type into the chat box if you can identify the 3 Tesla products in this photo.
Yeah.
Gotta look real hard at some of them because I failed this quiz in our practice.
It's tough, so you probably have to know a bit about Tesla to know it. Well, I'll start with the easiest one, which is the car, right? Most people probably know that Tesla makes electric cars, and you can see you can see a picture of the Tesla car there. So they say, look, you don't need gasoline, you don't even need a gas station. You got your Tesla car, and it can charge up at home. So what do you have other answers?
Yep, they're right there.
So that's right. So I see a couple answers. Yeah, so the other two Tesla products here are, first of all, the roof shingles. So Tesla just came out with roof shingles that are made of glass. They look pretty much like regular shingles, but they have solar panels built into them. So that's actually a solar generating roof. However, you as this homeowner might actually want to have electricity at night. So Tesla also makes what they call a Powerwall battery, which is that thing that sort of looks like an air conditioner right next to the chimney. And so Tesla's vision of the future is you put solar panels on your roof, you store the energy in a battery, and you run your car off of that energy, and you're completely self-contained. You don't need anybody. It's a great vision. It's really cool. It's really high-tech. It's also not particularly cheap. So if you bought all this stuff, you'd probably be out about $150,000. And while there's certainly people that think that's great and that would apply and work for a lot of people, there's also many people in the U.S. and especially around the world that don't have $150,000 to throw down on this kind of thing. Maybe it'll all become cheaper in the future, but here's an alternative third vision of what the future of energy looks like. But I'm going to wrap it up and take some questions, but I'd like to close by pointing out, like, we have a big kind of climate and energy transition challenge ahead. We kind of need to get global agreement on greenhouse gas emissions reductions. It doesn't make much sense in the case of climate change to try and go it alone. Right? If you reduce your emissions, you're affected by the emissions from every other country in the world, and other countries don't feel like reducing their emissions unless you're willing to as well. So you fortunately or not, have to work with other countries to make this happen. Everyone, including the developing world, that have to commit to leaving perfectly good fossil fuels in the ground. We're not about to run out of fossil fuels, so we have to somehow agree, like, look, there's oil and gas right there. We could get it, and we could use it, and it's really effective, but we have to decide, actually, let's not. Third, we need to shift electricity production to low-carbon or zero-carbon technologies. We also need to alter our transportation technologies, right, and switch away from oil for transportation. And then finally, in case this didn't sound challenging enough, we probably need to do all of this faster than any energy transition in history. So seems easy. The plus side, right, it's good business for engineers and people like me to try and figure out these solutions. Yeah, I guess that's the silver lining. Anyway, let's do some questions and discussion.
Wow, thank you. That was chock full of some really phenomenal information. Please submit your questions in the chat box. I'll get this question portion started. And maybe I'm going to ask maybe the blatantly obvious question, but so with all this facts, which sounds pretty convincing to me, why do climate change deniers actually exist out there? I put it out there. You can decline to answer.
No, I would never decline. So I can start off. So, I mean, I hate to point fingers too hard, but I'm going to have to in this case. I mean, there's definitely certain entities that have fossil fuel interests that have a strong interest, unfortunately, in maintaining the status quo for as long as possible. Certainly fossil fuels, transitioning to a climate change, strong climate regime means a lot less fossil fuels, and those companies have billions of dollars, some cases trillions of dollars of business that they want to do. I think the other thing, though, it's easy to point fingers at companies and say they're the problem, but on the other hand, we're the consumers of their products as well, right? And fossil fuels are really convenient ways to get energy, and so it's kind of a scary thought to say we're going to step away from this convenient, cheap energy source and switch to something that, at least for now, is going to be more expensive. But we're going to do it because we know it's right in the long term, right? Humans aren't very good long-term thinkers. We always think about today and tomorrow and not so much about the future. But in this case, the problem's just going to snowball on us and be pretty pretty big for the future generation.
And I want to add two things to that, which is that there's a combination, I think, also of to actually figure out what to do about it requires, trying to make projections about what the effects will be. This is a very, very complicated, complex process with lots of, assumptions you have to make, and, and in terms of creating these projections from a physical perspective, and then trying to translate those into, say, an economic impact requires a bunch of economic modeling, which is also hard and has a lot of uncertainty in it, and relies on a sense of how much you value money in the future, and that varies a lot from person to person. And I think a lot of the people saying that something doesn't exist is a lot of times not sort of an easier stance than, because it shuts down a conversation, than having a conversation about this is complicated and let's figure out how to address it. And so I think that's sort of been a sort of conscious decision, is it's easier to not have the conversation than to try to have a nuanced conversation about it.
Yeah. I mean, it's also pretty unfortunate that it's become politicized, right? Climate change used to be a bipartisan issue. I mean, the first George Bush, when he ran, one of the things that he talked about quite a bit was climate change and how important it was for the U.S. to take a global lead in climate change. And then it has become politicized, which means that half of everybody needs to somehow come down against it, because that's how politics works, right? And everything becomes a debate about on the merits. But anyway.
Well, thank you. Appreciate your insights there. We've got a couple questions coming in. So the question has to do with taking in or storing CO2 in a way to lessen the impact on the environment. Can you address that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So I didn't actually include that on my list, but that would be that was one of the things I dropped off of my list. So we have technologies that are running in pilot plants right now of carbon capture and sequestration. So the most effective way to do this is usually on the back end of a power plant, where you collect all the carbon and you pump it deep underground, basically in reservoirs that will hold it for hundreds or thousands of years usually. And so that's a way that we can continue using these cheap and effective fossil fuels, but not have the carbon emissions associated with them. CCS it's tricky. It's tricky technologically, but it's also really tricky politically. Like, one of the biggest issues with carbon capture and sequestration technologies is that it doesn't get any political support. Because traditionally in the U.S., for example, Republicans are more supportive of using fossil fuels, but they also more or less officially don't believe we should do anything about climate change. And there's literally no reason to capture CO2 and store it underground in a really fancy, expensive plant, and by the way, also taking an efficiency hit to cover the energy costs of all this carbon capture. There's no reason to capture and store CO2 unless you believe that emitting CO2 is a problem. And Republicans basically officially don't admit that emitting CO2 is a problem. Democrats, of course, do admit that emitting CO2 is a problem, but they don't really like fossil fuels, right? Democrats have kind of come down much more in favor of renewable energy as being the solution. So CCS can only really be supported by people that would like to continue using fossil fuels, but believe that we need to greatly reduce the CO2 in the atmosphere and are willing to spend money on it. And unfortunately, there's not really a political group that applies to, at least not in the U.S. And so CCS has been relatively well abandoned in the U.S., even though we're sort of poised to be a leader in the technology, because we're very good at building power plants, we're very good at drilling, we're very good at geology, at storing things underground. We're good at all the individual technologies, but we probably won't actually pursue the technology for political reasons.
Okay, another question came in on CO2. Is reforestation an option to offset CO2 emissions? And if so, what does it mean?
Yeah, so absolutely. Reforestation is definitely an option. Unfortunately, the downside is you have to find a place that you can reforest. So right now, unfortunately, we're mostly fighting against deforestation and trying to slow and stop deforestation. But reforestation would be an eventual option. You know, that's occurred, for example, in the Northeast U.S., right? Northeast U.S. event almost was clear-cut in the early days for farming, although we have since found that it's much more effective to farm in the Midwest. And so in all of New England and New York, the trees have regrown and absorbed an awful lot of CO2. So potentially that could happen in other places, but for now we're mostly just trying to stem the deforestation. But that's definitely a solution if we can make it happen.
Anything to add, Matt?
No, I mean, that's one of the things that, yeah, the location is really the issue, and you get different benefits depending on where you are, what latitude you are in terms of how much CO2 and what you would be sacrificing by doing that. Right, you put more CO2, you put more trees in very high northern latitudes, create more of those forests. You could offset some snow, right, and change the amount of light being reflected and things like that. So there's, but yeah, in general, it would do something. I actually don't know what the actual, you know, I don't know the numbers in terms of how much that would actually, if you were to reforest, you know, a large swath, how much that would bring it down. But, yeah.
Okay. Another question came in. I don't remember who, but it has to do with biomass seeming to be an interesting choice for a renewable source of energy. Is it possible?
Yeah. So biomass is very divisive. Okay. So for example, I'll give a few short data points here. In Europe, you know, they consider biomass to be renewable energy, and
Maybe
so
explain what biomass is.
Oh, biomass would be basically, well, there's a couple. Yeah. So biomass would be either using like corn to make ethanol for fuel, or burning wood grown in forests to make electricity. So
thank you.
Yeah, or we're making it out of algae. The next generation of biofuels would be like algae-based biofuels. So that's certainly a potential technology. Right now, the technologies that we use with biofuels, like in Europe, they use wood to make electricity, and they call it renewable. However, Europe doesn't have a lot of forests. So one of the weird things that's happening there is that in order to produce, quote, renewable energy, they're importing wood from Southeast Asia in order to burn it in their power plants and produce renewable energy. And this, I think everyone can probably follow the problematic implications of this. In the U.S., we use corn to make ethanol. So if you go to the gas station, it says, may contain up to 10% ethanol. It actually does contain 10% ethanol. And that's mostly made from corn. However, if you do the math on the what are called the life cycle emissions, because it takes energy to grow corn, it takes energy to move corn to the refinery plant, it takes energy to refine the corn. The life cycle emissions of the corn ethanol are barely better than gasoline anyway. So we don't really have a climate benefit from that right now. However, there's some promise for future technologies, like the algae-based biofuels that could potentially be beneficial environmentally, or at least more beneficial environmentally. So there's some excitement about that, but it's certainly a technical challenge at this point, and not a technology that we have a good solution on the shelf.
There are more questions. We're happy to stay on if our presenters can't for a few more minutes. Those of you who have to drop off, look for the email with the recording. A couple questions that have come in that we don't want to ignore necessarily, and I'm just going to read this verbatim. What are the implications of the production/building of energy-efficient tech? For example, if everyone residentially in the U.S. replace their lighting with LEDs or whatever CFLs are, what is the story of the carbon emissions that are a result of that increased demand in production, I guess, to manufacture that lighting source?
Yeah, so you're right. There's actually a similar question that someone else here asked about how renewable energy technologies are produced. So it takes, as a couple of people have pointed out, it takes energy to make products, right? And if the products are made in the U.S. or China or basically anywhere, the energy sources in the U.S. and China are predominantly fossil fuels. So it takes some fossil fuels to make solar panels, it takes some fossil fuels to make CFL light bulbs or LED light bulbs and all these things. And a lot of people have looked at that. For a solar panel, or for a solar, I'll start with solar panels. For a solar panel, we have this thing in my world called the energy return on investment. And the concept is, how much energy do you get out of a technology divided by how much energy it costs to make the technology in the first place. So for solar panels, the energy return on investment is pretty low, but it's more than 1. So it's usually around 5 are the best estimates. So that is to say that you get about 5 times as much energy out of a solar panel over its lifetime than it took to make the solar panel. So even if you used 100% fossil fuels to make the solar panel, it still is going to displace 5 times more energy than it took to make it. And of course, the more solar panels you make as you decarbonize the electricity grid, then future solar panels or anything that you make with that electricity will be cleaner. As far as light bulbs and other efficient technology, the energy return on investment is actually quite a bit higher than that. The efficiency stuff is basically, blows all of these other investments out of the water. Like with solar panels, for example, if you have government support, the return on investment is more or less about break even. You can make a little bit of money. Maybe in 5 or 10 years you won't need government support and you can still break even. You get your investment back in 5 or 10, 15 years. With something like an LED light bulb, the payback period for most light bulbs is like 6 months, right? So it's basically like an investment that pays back 200% return on investment. And the same thing is true on the energy side. It doesn't take that much energy to make an LED light bulb. In fact, one of the ways that you can look at this is it takes more energy to make an LED light bulb than an incandescent light bulb, but an incandescent light bulb burns out 20 times faster than an LED. So you really should compare what it costs to make 20 incandescent light bulbs versus 1 LED, which is about the same. And of course, the LED light bulb uses 1/8 of the electricity.
Thank you. One other question, because people are hanging on. So we're going back to the public discourse and policy. Why does it matter in public discourse what the source of climate change is? That pits one faction against another needlessly. The fact is global temps are rising. The question is not why. The question, in this person's perspective, is what can we do about it?
Yes. So.
Yeah. I mean, so the question is what can we do about it? But in addressing what can we do about it, you have to figure out what the main cause is in order to address it, right? And so, the fact is that, we saw some of the data that showed that fossil fuel is, the largest source. And so it's important to know what the impacts are, right? I mean, Eric showed that figure about what can be done, right, versus costs in terms of efficiency, giving you money. But you need to know what the cause is in order to try to fix it, right, or change it.
Yeah, that's right. At the risk of offending some people here, I'm going to say, right, like if you believe that the cause of autism is vaccines, then you're probably not going to do a very good job fighting autism because you're going to be focused on not giving kids vaccines, which won't actually solve the problem because, importantly, vaccines do not cause autism. And so the same thing with climate change, right? So since the source of the problem is basically greenhouse gases, our goal should be to reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases. Now, I agree, however, I wish it were less politicized. Right? I wish we could just say, look, we need to reduce CO2 emissions, we need to reduce methane emissions, and let's use all the technologies we have at our disposal. Let's not be partisan about it. Like my personal belief is that the problem is sort of a all hands on deck problem. Some people want to say, look, if this is just about renewables, we should get rid of nuclear power. And we shouldn't use CCS because that consumes fossil fuels. I sort of disagree. I think we should do anything we can, and as quickly as we can, do all of the above to reduce our CO2 emissions. So I wish it weren't quite so partisan. But I do think that we need to successfully deal with the problem, we need to all agree and admit that the source of the problem is greenhouse gases.
I'm with you. One last question, because we do got to go. There was a follow-up question to when we talked about the production of energy-efficient technology. So the follow-up is, what about the availability of the raw materials needed to create solar panels and other tech?
Yeah, so we have enough materials. So solar panels, the main material as far as volume or weight per solar panel is silicon. So we have plenty of sand around on Earth. Obviously, there's some semiconductor material as well in there, but we also have a sufficient amount of semiconductor material for decades of really rapid solar expansion. And as well, there are now technologies that use organic semiconductors, so we can essentially make them out of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, through our traditional chemical system. So if we ever started to get low on the semiconductor materials, we could transition to those. However, certainly in any industry, scaling up production rapidly is always a challenge. So there's always supply issues and where are we going to get all of our materials from. However, there aren't fundamental physical limitations there. It would be an engineering challenge similar to scaling up production of other similar products.
All right. Well, thank you so much to both Eric and Matt. This was beyond fascinating, dial-in. We could go on for the rest of the afternoon. But thank you to all of you who hung on, and thank you to our guests. The next webinar is in a couple of weeks. Now that we've all stressed out about climate change, we're going to have to regroup to mindfully manage our stress, and we'll get some techniques from Ann Walton. So I will forego the rest of my script. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Hope to see you in 2 weeks. Please take the very brief survey when you exit. You can exit by closing the window. Thank you.